There are so many people out there that want to make Japanese anime, but they're not Japanese. They're not part of the Japanese animation ecosystem. So, is it actually possible to make Japanese anime if you're not from Japan? I think so, but it takes a lot of very specific rules that we're going to talk about today because guess what? Everyone wants to make anime. Hey there, welcome back to Surviving Animation, your guide to making it in the business of cartoons. My name's Eric Calderon. Today, we're going to talk about how to make Japanese anime if you're not from Japan. And personally, I have a lot of experience in this. So, about 20 years ago, I actually worked for a company called Studio Gonzo. And although I was not the first, I was one of the early pioneers in really trying to bring Japanese anime to the West in maybe a new progressive new style of production. So over my 6 years working as a full-time executive there, I produced a show called Afro Samurai, which starred Samuel L. Jackson, was on Spike TV, a TV network that's no longer around. All the music was done by RZA from the Wu-Tang Clan, and to this day, it's still the only Japanese anime to actually ever win and be nominated for an Emmy. So that was pretty amazing. On top of that, I also produced Linkin Park's music video, Breaking the Habit, which won the MTV Video Music Award. And I also helped to create the first Japanese animation based on an American superhero comic called Witchblade, which is from a company called Top Cow that we produced completely as a Japanese anime in Japan. Was moderately successful. We did about 26 episodes, but really it still was a big breakthrough at the time. So over my time there working as a full-time exec and also for basically an additional 10 years after that, I spent a lot of time in Japan working with Japanese talent to try to make, kind of a new type of anime, an anime that fused a lot of what the East and West is. So I want to tell you what I learned. I want to tell you some of the pitfalls that I experienced, a little bit of my successes and failures, and really try to help you out there if you really believe that you want to try to make anime, but you're not part of the Japanese ecosystem. All right, before we go too deep into how to make anime, I want to get some semantics out of the way. So, there's a lot of discussion. There's always a back and forth on kind of what is real anime, what is American animation, and kind of what is the fusion in between. For a while, I used the term cowboy anime to refer to any anime inspired animation where the creative center is not Japan. And it seemed to kind of work for a lot of the anime inspired animation that I was encountering or that was made in the marketplace. But, as time passes, as so much more animation is happening, the lines are getting really gray. So I kind of think of it like a sushi restaurant in an odd way, which is, is a California roll or a Philadelphia roll or a Boston roll like real sushi, or is it totally an Americanization? I mean, ultimately, it doesn't really matter. I mean, if it's awesome, it's awesome. If you like it, you like it. And anything that tries to make it less than just something you like is, just an intellectual conversation. So let's just get this out of the way that if you want to call anything anime, call anything anime. If you want to say anything is really not anime, don't call it anime. It's fine. But in general, I'll try to create at least a structure that we can kind of organize the different types of animation that have a lot of anime influence in it so that we can kind of nail down what the thing is that you may want to make as a non-Japanese creator trying to make anime, as we call it. So let's go into semantics and kind of get that done. Okay, the first kind of anime that I'm actually not going to really talk too much about in this episode is the most traditional anime. So those kind of animes are the ones that are based on an existing Japanese manga that go through the traditional Japanese production committee business structure and then are distributed firstly in Japan through its typical distribution method. So that is really the bulk of what a lot of people consider like the true anime. It's, made in Japanese. It's produced with 100% Japanese staff. It's based on 100% Japanese manga that goes through the Japanese publishing system. And that's really like, the biggest bulk of the anime that's out there. Now, in addition to that, which I will also not be talking about today, are the original anime that have been created by Japanese directors or Japanese production companies, again, through that very traditional Japanese production committee structure, through traditional Japanese distribution systems, and were really meant with kind of a Japanese mindset. So the majority of the publishing work the smaller amount but still prevalent, totally original work from the entire Japanese community. Let's put that off to the side because that's not the kind of anime that you probably as the probably English speaking watcher of this episode and probably non-Japanese are going to be concerned about. So let's just put that all off to the side and move to the next category. Okay, now that I've kind of brought up the big category of anime that we're not really going to talk about, which is the, anime, Japanesey anime, I want to kind of at least tell people why it's so difficult to expect that coming from the West can create this kind of anime and this kind of structure with their kind of budgets, their kind of episode counts, and their kind of success. So, first, if you haven't heard of the Japanese production committee system, I made an entire video several years ago about that. So you can go to that video to understand just the core business model of the Japanese production committee. So again, the reason that it's so difficult for Westerners to understand is that really it is a company shell that combines really a consortium of different buyers together. They collect an existing and a successful manga. They drop that into the production committee as an IP. They then assign the entire thing to a production company. When the production company actually produces the work, all the stakeholders of the production committee receive all of the upside of that animation being distributed by distributing the license and merchandise that they have agreed to do. And, it's kind of this very, cohesive, complex, multi-headed system that, a brand new IP from the West really just has no business succeeding in because it wouldn't succeed in that territory. And the Japanese production committee is really mostly meant for the Japanese ecosystem. So, when Westerners come in and they want that, they run into that first big business cultural misunderstanding. So the only ways to break through that are, one, massive amounts of money. So if someone comes in with just a lump sum, there are some production companies, more and more recently, who will take that money and make the animation that is based on something that you've brought to the table. But they're not actually as motivated, especially because if that is a new IP, if it's a single sum of money, they're talking about getting paid once and never again. Whereas in the production committee structure, there's a vast selection of royalties across multiple products that a lot of people share in that is not the same as having a bulk of money. So anyway, but that is one way in. The other way in is, really kind of prestige or privilege in the sense that, maybe you're a celebrity or maybe you have a giant brand, which I'll talk about later, the things like Animatrix and Star Wars and Afro Samurai had these kind of like big brands and or celebrities that motivated companies. Or, maybe there's someone on your team who's actually a native Japanese speaker or already works bilingually into the Japanese animation production world. So in the case of Mech Cadets, which I'll talk about a little bit later, Patrick Awa, with their key art director, is a perfectly bilingual Japanese artist, and he was able to really, manage the IP from the Boom Studios, which is the American publisher, Polygon Pictures, who was the production company, and Netflix. So, that worked because he had the privilege of bridging the gap between all those languages. So that's another way. And the other way is to possibly have full distribution. So if you're Netflix, if you're Disney Plus, or if you're a creator with a deal with those companies, then a production company will speak to you because you not only have cash via your distributor, you actually have a distributed product, which means that they're very interested because they can be guaranteed that they'll not only get paid, but it will be seen, and that could open up the possibility of, recognition and or royalty and licensing sharing on the back end. So the last thing I just want to mention in terms of like the difficulties of Westerners coming in and expecting Japanesey anime, I just have to tell people that one of the biggest pitfalls is to try to develop the story with the Japanese anime production studio. Now, no slight against Japanese production studios in general, but their entire ecosystem does not have a long history in the creation, writing, and development of original IP. They have done it. There are case studies, but just by and large, because they're doing so much of their production based on a completed story that's already visually developed in print form, i.e., manga, coming in with an idea and money and wanting to develop the story with them. Just, I haven't historically seen it work that well. I had some of my own failures trying to make it work that well because there's just always cultural differences in storytelling style and storytelling pace. The screenplay itself is in a different format. The transition from, script to storyboard is just kind of a what I call like a Spanish and Portuguese, in the sense that you think they're similar, but they're really not similar at all. And then, really how the production process and the political power of different people are just completely different. So in the Japanese production model, really the original manga author is kind of the top person there. The next in line is probably like the Japanese director, and then there's going to be the production committee, then there's going to be the mech designer, then there's going to be the storyboard artist, then there's going to be like the writer, which is at the bottom, because the writer is just really taking the existing manga and organizing it in a way that the director can then lead the rest of the show. But of course, we're all looking up to the ultimate leader, which is the original manga author, who kind of has the final moral say on if something's right and wrong. So that's the Japanese side. Now, on the Western side, especially in television, a lot of times we put the writer at the top. I mean, they are usually the originator of the IP if you're talking about an idea that's not an adaptation. Then right after that is going to be the studio, which is really, the financier. Oh, by the way, in the Japanese system, the money side doesn't directly get involved with the creative, and the creative doesn't get inside with the money, so they kind of they church and state those two things. Where on the Western side, the writer and the studio are like the number one and number two. So if the studio gives you notes, you have to take it. If the writer changes their mind, you have to take it. Now, underneath those two is going to be the production company. And underneath the production company is going to be the supervising animation director, and then probably the individual episode directors, and then the storyboard artist. So you see how it's not exactly flipped, but it's kind of flipped and incompatible. So, the biggest lesson I learned, and what I'd like to pass on to you if you're watching, is, do not try to develop your story with Japan unless you have some of these incredible, perfect East meets West collaboration timings, or talent collaborations, which I'll talk about next. But anyway, that's kind of the big lesson of why a lot of Westerners cannot expect to have positive results and get the kind of most Japanese anime that they may know and love already. All right, let's start with the first category that I'm going to call the most Japanesey of the anime co-productions and fusion projects that we're going to talk about today. And those are really the ones that are kind of like Bakugan, maybe a little bit like Studio Trigger's Cyberpunk Edge Runners. These are the productions that actually have some kind of financial or IP or toy company backing outside of Japan, but those companies, those financial structures, those IP are really permitting the Japanese side to do almost anything, carte blanche, and create a product that is as Japanese as they want, but has some kind of association or some connection canonically or businessy with the West. So how do these work? They really work with two specific things in mind. One is, the financial commitment from these comes from outside of Japan, like the case of Bakugan. But then, there's a very specific need. So in the Bakugan case, it's actually a product, and that product has to be expressed and shown in an exciting world that has a lot of toy play in it. And then the rest really just let Japan do what it does, because they have to produce something in bulk for 100 episodes, really to promote a toy product that will be distributed in Japan and then the rest of the world. So Bakugan is really, a good example of like the Japanesey kind of co-production. So the other one, which I just mentioned, is CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk Edge Runners. So it's very Japanesey in the sense that, they were permitted, and director Imaishi was permitted this massive amount of creative freedom to, tell a story in his specific visual style that is really unique to him. Now, what's interesting about this one is the massive lore, the library of information, the canonical connection to the original Cyberpunk game was very carefully curated and very carefully handed off to the Japanese team in a way that they could make sure that whatever they make is consistent to the gameplay. So, in the case of Edge Runners, there was even a team placed in Japan from CD Projekt Red, but again, all Japan was permitted to do whatever it wants. So, what do we learn from this kind of Japanesey style anime production? So, if you're interested in producing this kind of stuff, it's easy in the sense that it can be done. There are case studies, and they've been very successful. The flip side is to remember to make these things kind of work is to front load the development, front load the need, front load the mission that animation has to achieve, and then hand it over and let it go, because it would be relatively impossible or difficult for companies like Spin Master, companies like CD Projekt Red to get the production value and schedule and budget and final product of those kind of shows with constant Western interference. So you can do this kind of shows. You just have to realize that the rules work as they work. Everyone stands in their place. And actually, in the case of Spin Master, as the second and third season of Bakugan was made, Spin Master from the West got a lot more involved because the first season really set up the tone and the pace so that Western talent could come in and be more involved in writing the show and making it consistent with the earlier episodes. In the case of CD Projekt Red, is really solely based on Imaichi's incredible talent, his incredible ability, and his willingness to fully accept upfront in the development process the entire universe of CD Projekt's Red Cyberpunk 2077 and really make it something his own that to many out there think is a very full traditional Japanese anime, but surprise, surprise, it's based on a Western video game. So let's move slightly west from the really Japanese anime co-productions and talk about what I call the Japanese adaptations. So these are Japanese anime productions that are actually based on a Western franchise. There is a little bit of Western involvement in terms of screenplay, initial development, and story conceit, but then it starts to get thrown over to the Japanese side for actual production and finishing, and then back to the US often for dubbing, even though it's done in both languages. So what falls in this category are shows like Terminator Zero or Blade Runner, Black Lotus, Pacific Rim is a good one. What I find interesting about these co-productions and what there is to learn about them is that they involve, first and foremost, a very successful Western franchise. And that franchise has to be aligned with the idea that they're going to do an adaptation into the medium of Japanese anime in order to further extend their franchise's return on investment, their expansion into new universes, into new worlds. And I'm kind of on the fence on whether or not these are successful or if the marketplace likes them or if they just kind of all score in the kind of B to B plus zone. I can't say that I've seen a massive hit in any of these, but I think there are some really well-reviewed shows. I think what makes something like Pacific Rim interesting is that, Pacific Rim is kind of a Western franchise that's influenced by Godzilla that was directed by an American, but then brought back to Japan to make it into a big kaiju fighting giant robot thing. And the word kaiju itself is a Japanese word. So it's really kind of this back and forth basketball game of influence of, who really is influencing who. But ultimately, the production model for Pacific Rim is closer to the Western model, which is, the scripts, the development, the financing was done in the US. It was then sent to Polygon Pictures, done as a full 3D animation with Japanese directors and Japanese production. But, again, trying to figure out where this sits in the gray middle of American animation and Japanese animation isn't the point. The point is what we're going to learn from something like this is that does take just a massive amount of money, a bought-in distributor, a bought-in financer, an IP that is wanting to expand itself, and then an available and willing Japanese production company who will take the Western materials and adapt them into what will ultimately be an anime, but just a little bit more influenced by the West than the super Japanesey stuff. One other, kind of mention I will put out there is Lazarus, which is a recent episode, a recent TV series produced and directed by Watanabe-san, who did the Cowboy Bebop franchise. What I find interesting about Lazarus, it's really a complete Japanese anime production in the most traditional sense, but all the fight choreography was actually, I heard, assisted by the director of John Wick. So there's this kind of new flavor and new style to the fight choreography. I don't know where that one sits, but it's kind of an interesting case study to bring up. All right, let's move into one of the most complex but interesting types of anime that Westerners have done. And this is the real true East meets West productions. Now, these productions include shows like Afro Samurai, like the Animatrix, like, Scott Pilgrim, even Star Wars Visions, Season 1 and Season 3, which were done completely with Japanese anime studios. And in some ways, Transformers, although the first season of Transformers was completely a Western production and then animated in Japan, but then subsequent seasons were actually done for the Japan market only, and then it was back and forth. So, it kind of went all over the place over its, 30 years out there. But, in talking about the true East meets West collaborations, I think there are a few key points worth mentioning. So in the case of both Afro Samurai and Animatrix, what you really had was at the top level in terms of the creators on both sides. There was really a kind of meeting in the middle to have the vision of something that is truly new and interesting that involves kind of the best of both partners' talents. So in the case of Afro Samurai, the original concept came from a character designer, an illustrator named Takashi Okazaki. It was then kind of discovered by me. I optioned and purchased the rights through Studio Gonzo. We produced a visual pilot with an initial director, and then we kind of brought it in-house at Studio Gonzo, created a bunch of sales materials, and went out and tried to find a financier. In this case, we were really fortunate to find Samuel L. Jackson as kind of a first person who just said, "This is incredible, I want to be involved." And with Samuel Jackson attached, we then sold it directly to Spike TV and sold it to them as kind of a unique miniseries, which is something they hadn't really done before, but I kind of presented them to them as kind of a movie-like experience done over a couple weeks based on this incredible visual piece with Samuel Jackson attached, different than anything they've done before, and they just kind of went for it. Now, when that was all kind of fixed, we actually had a budget, we had a delivery date, and then we had to figure out how to make the production work. So what we did is I initially set kind of rules to the game. I said Okazaki had all these incredible pieces of lore. He had all this, kind of ideas. He wasn't really a writer by nature, but he had like 1,000-year timeline and all these different characters. It was just a lot of beautiful stuff, but it was kind of, prose. It was kind of history. There wasn't really kind of a big full arc. And I said, well, if we're going to land this in 5 episodes, it's going to be a revenge story that was always built into the nature of the initial intellectual property. But let's just make sure that we make the character have an exciting fight in every episode. And let's just make sure that the full story arc of Afro finding the guy who killed his dad is kind of complete. However that will end, let's make sure to complete that arc in the first 5 episodes. Now, with that in mind, Samuel Jackson actually was really brilliant about bringing up a lot of the revenge stories, a lot of the fighting stories seen in classic samurai dramas that he had grown up watching. It was then that the Japanese director, Mr. Kizaki, was able to kind of catch that influence, kind of take my initial producerial request and use that to start to sculpt some of his ideas and kind of bring the story in a little bit. And it was at that point that we brought in a Japanese writer, a couple of American writers, and really started to collaborate. It was a very difficult but kind of magical time when all these different talented people had one vision that we could all clearly see, because there was just something about Afro Samurai that we all just kind of got intuitively. And to top it off, whenever RZA was attached to do the music, he kind of created the musical story that he told me about, which is really based on this almost generational idea that in the 70s there was soul music, and then when the 80s came, rock music killed soul music, And then in the 90s, hip hop came, incorporated a bunch of soul, and then beat rock. So we had this incredible, kind of spine on top of which to build this story. So to make these east-west productions work, you almost need all of that alignment. Everyone has to have the same vision of what this new-ish thing is that you want to make. And it's got to be based on a lot of very specific and tried and true and understandable cultural points. And once you kind of have all these tent poles set up and everyone fully agrees, then it's possible to make. So Afro Samurai, Animatrix, Star Wars Visions, they all kind of followed this kind of magical communion of these different talents. I mean, in the case of Animatrix, in the case of Star Wars, the lore itself, the existing movie or movies, created such a gravity well of data that everyone could kind of look to understand what this thing's about, that anything new had that authenticity attached to it. So whether or not it was a new directing team or a new style or a new approach, because it fit the existing canon that was so clear in the creators and the public's mind, these adaptations work really well. Now I will, give even extra points to Scott Pilgrim, because Scott Pilgrim with Science Saru and really the original writer and the original character designer, again, a very East meets West fusion kind of artist, were really able to find a specific tone, a specific comedy style, and then most wonderfully, a really great story, because Scott Pilgrim is not that interesting. What's really interesting is Ramona, the girlfriend who's got 7 ex-boyfriends. So the fact that they took the movie, flipped it on its head, and then told it from the other point of view, I mean, again, this is where these magical East meets West combinations happen. So they're very hard. They happen very rarely. But when they do, it's almost like the dream come true for a lot of people that want to make anime. And I hope some of those anecdotes help you understand a little bit more. But let's move on to the next category. All right, the next one's kind of a big category, and in many ways it doesn't involve Japan, but actually the final product and the creation ends up feeling very much like anime. And a lot of people have called or confused these as anime, but you know what? They're just awesome, so who cares what you call them, like I mentioned before. So what kind of falls in this category, which I'll, for this video, call Anime of the West, is stuff like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Castlevania, Teen Titans, the original version, all the Voltron remakes, Thundercats Roar, the incredible 2011 series, Devil May Cry, Mech Cadets, Ultraman Rising. The list kind of gets bigger and bigger. Now, Anime of the West, as I'll call them, is really just a Western production team with so much cultural penetration of how anime is made that through the traditional Western production method creates something that looks like anime. So what's interesting about this kind of anime is you can make it. Anyone can make it who's non-Japanese. But I think just like any other animation right now, the barriers are going to be the same as traditional animation. So, right now in 2025, it really feels like you just need an existing or legacy IP. You again have to have a full patron or financer who is probably going to be your distributor or is a big IP holder with a massive marketing budget that they want to use to create content, to promote their IP, whatever that is. You need perhaps a giant private investor or a private investment company, a distribution strategy, and then ultimately when you make the thing that you're going to make, what is the monetization of this? How are people making money off this? If it's the streamer's commission and it's a production margin, that's fine. But maybe this, Anime of the West is to launch a new toy line or a licensing plan or a new video game, etc., etc. So Anime of the West doesn't need anyone from Japan. I mean, in the exception here, Thundercats Roar, which is actually produced by Studio 4C, there was still a lot of Western talent on that. A lot of the key character design, a lot of the layouts, a lot of the storyboards, and of course, all the scripts and the original voices were done in America before the Japanese production team was involved. And in this case, they really acted more like a overseas studio than a true kind of Japanese studio who really normally drives the storytelling and production style of a film or a TV series. So Anime of the West, massive category. You can do it as a non-Japanese person. It's just as hard as making any other TV series in animation. But, the people who make it have to really deeply, deeply love anime so much that it is a natural part of their way of making. So I think we're going to see a lot more and more of this as the next generation of artists and directors and animators who are non Japanese have really absorbed and taken the Japanese aesthetic and basically turned it into hip hop. It's just a language that they speak all the time. It's to them what cartoons are as they draw. We're going to see a lot more anime than West. So I think it's the biggest growing category in this world. But hey, guess what? In that sense, you can make anime. I want to take just a second to talk about three very specific titles that are completely not anime at all, but some people may think are very heavily influenced by anime. Some may sometimes confuse them as anime, but they're just worth mentioning because they're kind of the unachievable, which is Arcane, Blue Eye Samurai, and Spider-Verse. So let's talk about those as a group. What makes these the apex of animation is that they are just all of them massively, massively budgeted. I mean, everyone knows all the stories about how much Arcane costs and how it took 10 years. Everyone knows that Spider-Verse, the first movie was really lightning in a bottle. It was the perfect combination of a multiverse story, of an incredible design aesthetic, of a one-of-a-kind team, of a one-of-a-kind production model. It just knocked it out of the park in every possible way. And then, Blue Eye Samurai, which is made in France. And it's so funny that I sometimes look up articles and they still call it anime. Again, I guess I shouldn't complain that they're calling it anime, but it's made in France. None of that was made in Japan, even though the entire story is completely Japanese. It takes place in Japan. It's historical Japan. And actually some of the character design I think I saw in the making of is actually based on, Bunraku shadow puppets. So it is so Japanese culturally, but it is zero Japanese in terms of being an anime. Anyway, these apex animations are worth mentioning because that is just what happens when the best talent in the world gets the best budgets in the world and the best schedule and can create, whatever they want. So if you're in that category, you don't have to call it anything. It's just awesome. Okay, this has just by far been one of the longest episodes I've ever made. I just have a lot to say and I have a lot of opinions about Japanese anime co-productions and fusions. In my 30 years in the business, I spent almost half of that working with Japanese talent and Japanese IP and Japanese production systems. So I've got a lot of wisdom, a lot of battle scars, a lot of anecdotes, a lot of theories. I hope you didn't mind going through that. I hope you got something out of that. If you have opinions, please comment below. I'd love to hear what you think about doing anime as a non-Japanese creator. And I will see you in the next one.